more.
They
They
like
feel
it
more compelled to read.
more.
Yeah.
Okay, well, good. In that way, that's
Yeah, that's a good one.
well, then it'll be a bestseller.
Your life.
Om Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsa Chanuramardhanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishna Vande Jagadgurum. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to our ongoing class on Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. We're in class 55, so we're deep into this text. Chapter 7. We're going to be discussing today, hopefully, I want to get through 7 verses. So verses 8 through 14 of chapter 7. There's a lot of material. Please save your questions for the end, unless it's absolutely necessary. And a heads up for the next few classes. Here's the thing. I thought we'd only have 2 Gita classes in the month of September, but I'm proposing that we meet again for a 3rd class this month on September 28th, Sunday, at 9:30 a.m. And the reason for that is I'm going to be traveling quite a bit in October. I'll be gone the first week of October. I'll be in Texas doing book signings and stuff, and then in Las Vegas, our Las Vegas Center, for similar kind of thing in the middle of the month, and then I'm lecturing elsewhere. So I only have room for 1 Gita class in October, and that is going to be Sunday, October 26th. So the very end of October, 9:30 a.m. Okay, so our next 2 classes, there's a big gap between these 2 classes. Our next class is going to be held on Sunday, September 28th, 9:30 a.m., right before my Sunday talk on the same day. And the assignment for our next class is read carefully verses 15 through 22 of chapter 7 of the Gita, along with a new chapter from Essays on the Gita. Okay, what is that new chapter? The very next chapter. It's a very, very interesting chapter. It's called The Synthesis of Devotion and Knowledge. Reconciling Jnana and Bhakti. Pages 278 to 288 of Sri Aurobindo's Essays on the Gita. And I've given some study questions, which I'd like you to answer and submit, as usual, the day before, by Saturday, September 27th at 7 p.m. Okay, so that's the assignment for our next class to be held on September 28th, Sunday, 9:30 a.m. And then our 1 October class will be on almost a month later, Sunday, October 26th at 9:30 a.m. All right, now, let's plunge in. We were in the last verse that we had discussed last time. It was verse 7.7. Mattaha parataram nanyat kinchidasya dhananjaya mai sarvanam protam sutre manigana eva. Bhagavan Krishna uses a beautiful metaphor to explain how he relates to this world of names and forms. What's the metaphor? He says, I'm like a thread upon which many pearls are threaded, right? And then I added that, and Sri Aurobindo points out, that we shouldn't push the analogy too far, because then it'll imply a kind of dualism or a distinction, qualitative distinction between God and this world, which the Gita denies. Okay, so in fact, everything in this world is nothing but different real manifestations of the divine. Okay, that's the thesis. Now, the subsequent verses, the ones that we focus on today, 8 through 14, I see it as basically explaining the nature of the different kinds of, the different ways that the divine manifests in this world. Okay, so if we remember Sri Ramakrishna's teaching, the Vijnani sees that Brahman has become the 24 cosmic principles, right? So how? Like, what's the process by which the divine becomes the 24 cosmic principles and the jivas? That's kind of what these verses are explaining. So what I propose we do is read verses 8 through 10 as a block, a 3-verse block, and then we'll talk about them, and then we'll move on. Okay, so please repeat after me, starting with verse 8. Rasoham apsu kaunteya prabhasmi Shashi Suryayoho Pranavaha Sarvavedeshu Shabdahakhe
Shabdake.
Paurusham Nrishu.
Paurusham Nrishu.
9. Punyo Gandaha
Punyo Gandaha.
Prithivyam cha
Prithivyam cha.
Tejaschasmi
Tejaschasmi.
Vibhavaso
Vibhavaso.
Jivanam
Jivanam.
Sarvabhuteshu
Sarvabhuteshu.
Tapaschasmi
Tapasyanandaji.
Tapasvishu.
Tapasyanandaji.
10. Bijam mam sarvabhutanam
Bijamam sarvabhutanam.
Vidhi partha
Vidhi partha.
Sanatanam
Sanatanam.
Buddhir
Buddhir.
Buddhimatam
Buddhimatam.
Asmi
Asmi.
Tejas
Tejas.
Tejasvinamaham.
Tejasvinamaham.
Alright, let's pause here. So let's look at all three of these verses. They go together. I'll briefly give a rough translation here. So, Bhagavan Krishna says, so how do I manifest in this world? I am taste in water, O son of Kunti. I am the light of sun and moon. I am Pranava. Pranava means Om. Okay, the word Om, the mantra Om. I am Pranava in all of the Vedas. Pranava sarva Vedeshu. And then Shabda Ke, I am sound in ether. And I am manhood in men. Paurusham Nrishu. Among men I am manhood. So that's verse 8. So what's he doing? He's basically saying, I'm the essence of all of these things, right? The divine essence in all things. Then in verse 9 he says, Punyaha Gandaha. I am pure scent in earth. Prithivyam cha. So he is the scent in both. He is the Punya Gandaha, the pure scent in the Prithivi, in earth. He is also Tejas Jasmi Vibho Aso. He is also the energy of light in fire. And then he says, Jivanam Sarvabhuteshu. I am life in all existences. The thing that gives us biological life. I am the, and then he says, Tapaschasmi Tapasvishu. So among Tapasvis, among those who practice austerities, I am Tapas. He is Tapas among those who engage in Tapas. Okay. So that's 8 and 9. And we're going to read Sri Aurobindo's really interesting commentary on these verses in a second. But I just want to give you the simple meaning first. And then verse 10. Bijam mam sarvabhutanam. Krishna says, know me, O Arjuna, to be the eternal seed of all existences. The seed of all existences. And then he says in the next line, I am the intelligence of the intelligent. Among intelligent people, I am the intelligence in them. Buddhihi buddhimatam asmi. And then Krishna is the tejas among those who are energetic. So tejas in the sense of being energetic. I am the energy of the energetic. Tejas vinamaham. Okay. And we'll pause here. So now, first of all, let's look at Sri Aurobindo's commentary on this. So 271, let's look at this. It's Sri Aurobindo at his most ingenious, involving these three terms, Madbhava, Swabhava, and Bhavaha. Okay, so let's look at it carefully. He says, this is right after he explains the pearl metaphor from 7.7. He says, this one supreme power, so Paraprakriti, remember Shakti, Chit Shakti, Divine Mother, manifests not only in all as the one. Let's be careful. So manifest not only in all, in everything, as the one with the capital O. What is that one? The Purushottama, I think. Okay. But in each as the Jiva with the capital J. But in each of us, he's also the Jiva. So the full Purushottama is in us, in our hearts, and at the same time, he manifests as a Jiva in all of us, the individual soul. So he says, but in each as the Jiva, the individual spiritual presence. So your Jiva is distinct from my Jiva and so on. Those are also divine manifestations. It manifests also as the essence of all quality of nature. This is the third way that the divine manifests in this world. The essence of all quality of nature. The verses we just read are examples of that. He is the scent in water and so on and so forth. Then he says, these are therefore the concealed spiritual powers behind all phenomena, without exception. That's why Sri Ramakrishna says again and again, God has become all 24 of the cosmic principles, without exception. You can't point to something and say it's not divine, because literally everything is divine. Even the bad stuff is divine. And we'll see how. How is the bad stuff divine? And how does the badness of the bad stuff not affect or contaminate the divine? These are very important questions that are raised in these verses that we'll be discussing today. And Sri Aurobindo, I think, has a very insightful explanation of these verses. So then he says, this highest quality is not the working of the three gunas, which is phenomenon of quality and not its spiritual essence. So he's already beginning to presuppose these terms. He's going to introduce them explicitly in a couple sentences. But he's basically saying that these, the highest quality even of inanimate things, like the essence of wood or something and other things, there's something divine in that. Okay. And it's only when there's a kind of degradation of it that you end up with what he calls bhavas. That comes up in a later verse in the Gita, just in a few verses. Okay, but let's keep reading and then we'll so that he can introduce the meaning of these terms. So he says, it is rather the inherent one yet variable inner power of all these superficial variations. It is a fundamental truth of the becoming, with a capital B. A truth that supports and gives a spiritual and divine significance to all its appearances. So instead of saying this world is unreal, it's a veil of tears, everything is actually divine. The workings of the gunas are only the superficial, unstable becomings of reason, mind, sense, ego, life, and matter. And he's quoting directly from verse 7.12, which we'll get to in a second. Sattvika bhavaha rajasas tamasascha. This is the term, bhava. The word bhava in this context refers to what he calls the secondary derivations of the inferior prakriti. Remember the distinction between two kinds of prakriti, inferior and superior, apara prakriti and para prakriti. Bhavas refer to the inferior prakriti comprised of the three gunas. What are some simple examples? Lust, anger, greed, egoism, selfishness. Sri Ramakrishna used the term. What term did Sri Ramakrishna use to refer to these things?
Woman and gold.
That's true. Yeah,
Avidya?
Kamini Kanchan.
Avidya?
Huh?
Avidya?
Avidya Maya.
Avidya.
Avidya Maya. He used these two different kinds of Maya, Avidya Maya and Vidya Maya. So this would be Avidya Maya. Okay. Ignorance, the delusive aspect of the divine. Yeah. Okay. And why secondary derivation? Because notice how the structure works. We're going to see. Well, let's first let him define the terms, and then we'll see how it's a secondary derivation. So, he says, okay, but this is rather so the workings of the gunas.
Yeah.
Let me read this. It's Aurobindo. You have to start again from the. Okay, so let me start with the beginning of the sentence. The workings of the gunas are only the superficial, unstable becomings of reason, mind, sense, ego, life, and matter. Sattvika bhava rajasas tamasascha. But this is rather so the divine manifestations. This is rather the essential, stable, original, intimate power of the becoming, swabhava. Okay, different term here, swabhava. Instead of bhava, it's swabhava. Okay. I roughly translate it as one's own divinely ordained law of being. Okay. One question that this section raises, I don't have a definitive answer to this. I want you guys to give your own answers. Do even inanimate objects have swabhava? Or is he only referring to jivas as having swabhava? Sometimes he speaks as if, just see. Let me keep reading and then you'll see. So, think about it for yourselves though. So he says, but this is rather the essential, stable, original, intimate power of the becoming, swabhava. Becoming seems very general, and why shouldn't that also apply to inanimate things? So that's at least an initial assumption. So, does he end up applying swabhava only to jivas or to everything? Let's see. It is that which determines the primary law of all becoming and of each jiva. So notice what he's doing. Again, I think,
He's including everything.
He seems to be including everything and saying that swabhava in the jiva takes a certain form, and there's a swabhava of a table and of a book and of a rock. That's how I see it. Okay.
That makes sense, though.
That everything, there's a divine kind of, it's like the way that Peace Pilgrim puts it. She says that we have to discover our place in life's pattern, in the divine cosmos, the divine economy. What's our role? How do we uniquely serve the divine? Well, and that applies to inanimate things too, because even that's why Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, when I think a monk, he was using a broom and then tossed it aside to the corner of a room, and she said, no, you shouldn't. You should treat inanimate objects also with respect, because they're also the divine. They have a role to play. They help us to clean things and so on. So I was thinking of that.
Like each element has an atomic number.
Yeah.
Which is unique
Unique,
to it.
right, to that thing. So maybe
that's the
yeah.
swabhava
The unique essence.
of that.
The unique
thing.
essence of everything, exactly. Yeah.
Swami, what page are you on the online one?
271 of Essays on the Gita. Yeah. Okay, now, it is a principle in each creature, he's explaining swabhava, the middle term here, that derives from and is immediately related to a transcendent divine becoming, that of the Ishvara, madbhava. So you see how that's the primary derivation. Swabhava is primary derivation from madbhava, and it's divine, and it's perfect. And actually in spiritual life, what we're trying to do is move from this level, the secondary level of bhava, to this higher divine level of swabhava, to discover our true, how do we become true channels of the divine, true instruments of the divine. We're confused by the three gunas and by ego and by all these things. So we have to transcend that confusion through worship of the divine and through karma yoga and so on, until we can identify what our swabhava is and then act accordingly, serve the divine based on our swabhava. Okay, then he says, in this relation of the divine bhava, so the mad bhava, mad means Krishna's own bhava, so the divine Purushottama, to the swabhava, the unique law of being of each jiva and of everything in the world, and of the swabhava to the superficial bhavaha, that's a secondary derivation. Now you see why secondary, because it's two removes from mad bhava. Of the divine nature, so this is another way that he defines this madbhava. Divine nature to the individual self nature. So he says this is divine nature. Swabhava is then individual self nature. Our unique essence. What's our unique role in this world, in this cosmic lila? And then of the divine nature to the individual self-nature, which is swabhava, and of the self-nature in its pure and original quality, that's the swabhava, to the phenomenal nature in all its mixed and confused play of qualities, that means gunas, the three gunas. We find the link between that supreme and this lower existence. So this is, we can say, in short, phenomenal nature. That's just an easy way to summarize. In the form of the three gunas, the phenomenal nature. Okay. Now, then he starts explaining how these bhavas ultimately also can be traced back to the divine, but how they differ at the same time. He says, the degraded powers and values of the inferior prakriti, apara prakriti, derive from the absolute powers and values of the supreme Shakti. How is that derivation? You see the arrows, that's why they're down here. Even the bhavas derive from madbhava, from the divine Purushottama. Okay. And must go back to them. So then this is your suggestion to do the up arrows. so we can actually add the up arrow. We can go both. It's a two-way traffic. Spiritual practice, we can go up from the bhavas to the madbhava. Okay. Good. And must go back to them to find their own source and truth and the essential law of their operation and movement. So too, the soul or jiva involved here in the shackled, poor, and inferior play of the phenomenal qualities, so stuck at the level of bhavas, inferior prakriti, apara prakriti, of the phenomenal qualities, if he would escape from it and be divine and perfect, must by resort to the pure action of his essential quality of swabhava, his own law of being, go back to that higher law of his own being, in which he can discover the will, the power, the dynamic principle, the highest working of his divine nature. So the struggle here for us as spiritual aspirants is to discover how we can be perfect instruments of the divine, how we can best carry out the divine will, how do we align our will with the divine will. We do that by discovering our swabhava, our place in life's pattern. Okay. And then he says, this is his segue into explaining these verses which we just read. This is clear from the immediately subsequent passage in which the Gita gives a number of instances to show how the divine in the power of his supreme nature, paraprakriti, Shakti, manifests and acts within the animate and so-called inanimate existences of the universe. So-called inanimate, that's interesting. Nothing in the deepest sense, is inanimate because everything is divine. Is divine consciousness. That was Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana realization when he's doing puja. The puja vessels he's using, apparently inanimate, God, divine consciousness, suffused with, pulsating with consciousness. The door sill, pulsating with consciousness. The cat, pulsating with consciousness. Right? That's why it's so-called inanimate. We may disentangle them from the loose and free order which the... Now, this is important because we get this laundry list of different things and how the divine manifests in these different things. Sri Aurobindo says, let's not take the order too strictly. Why? Because remember, the scripture is written in poetic form. And poets, any poet will know, and songwriters, that you have to meet the meter and the rhythm and all that, you may have to do some rearrangement and whatever. But he's saying from a philosophical standpoint, we can rearrange some of the items in this list. So he's saying, we may disentangle them from the loose and free order which the exigence of the poetical form imposes and put them in their proper philosophical series. It's more or less in the order of the Gita, but with some differences. So he says, first, the divine power and presence works within the 5 elemental conditions of matter. Okay, so he's starting really from just so-called inanimate things. Okay, and he's saying, using the Sankhyan term, that God manifests in the form of the tanmatras, the subtle essences of all these apparently inanimate things. Okay, and he gives examples, the ones we just talked about. I am taste in the waters, sound in ether, scent in earth, energy of light and fire. So those are 4. Actually, there are 5 tanmatras in Sankhya. So what does he say? And it may be added for more completeness, touch or contact in air. So he adds the 5th one, which is missing from this list. So he's saying the divine Purushottama manifests as the tanmatras, the subtle essences, in all these things like water and ether and earth and so on. That is to say, the divine himself in his paraprakriti, that supreme nature, is the energy at the basis of the various sensory relations, of which, according to the ancient Sankhya system, the ethereal, the radiant, electric and gaseous, the liquid and the other elemental conditions of matter are the physical medium. What he's referring to is in Sankhya cosmology, there's a distinction between the mahabhutas, the 5 elements themselves, and the 5 tanmatras from which they derive, which are more subtle essences. And so the divine is the tanmatra, the subtle essence of each of these 5 elements. That's the idea. That's how you see or identify the divine in even so-called inanimate things. Okay. And then he kind of works his way up to sentient creatures and all that. So then he says, the 5 elemental conditions of matter, so what he's referring to, the Sankhya term here is mahabhutas. They derive from the tanmatras. This is the subtle essence. So the divine manifests as the tanmatras in all these 5 elements, the mahabhutas, okay, using the Sankhya terms, which of course the Gita borrows from. He says then, the 5 elemental conditions of matter, mahabhutas, are the quantitative or material element in the lower nature and are the basis of material forms. The 5 tanmatras, taste, touch, scent, and the others are the qualitative element. Okay. These tanmatras are the subtle energies whose action puts the sensory consciousness in relation to the gross forms of matter. They are the basis of all phenomenal knowledge, and so on and so forth. I'm going to skip some stuff here. Okay. Then, he moves on to explain the swabhava. How much of this should I read? Okay, so page 273, we'll read a little bit. He says, but energy or power of being in nature is the divine himself in his prakriti. Each sense in its purity is therefore that prakriti. Each sense is the divine in his dynamic conscious force. Okay. Then he says, this we gather better from the other terms of the series. And then he quotes from the verses we read. I am the light of sun and moon. So notice how he's rearranging now. The manhood in man, the intelligence of the intelligent, the energy of the energetic, the strength of the strong, the ascetic force of those who do ascesis, tapasya. And then he adds finally, he quotes, I am life in all existences. That's the Jivanam Sarvabhuteshu in verse 9. He says, in each case, it is the energy of the essential quality on which each of these becomings depends for what it has become. That is given as a characteristic sign indicating the presence of the divine power in their nature. So the essential quality in all these things is the divine. Again, I am Pranava in all the Vedas, he says. That is to say, the basic syllable Om, which is the foundation of all the potent creative sounds of the revealed word. Okay. And then we read in verse 10, Bijam mam sarvabhutanam viddhipata sanatanam, know me to be the eternal seed of all existences. He singles this out and he says, this is the most general declaration that Krishna makes. He's saying at the bottom of page 273, he says, therefore the Gita throws in as the most general statement in the series, know me to be the eternal seed of all existences, O son of Pritha. This eternal seed is the power of spiritual being, the conscious will in the being, the seed which, as is said elsewhere, he has in mind 14.3, which comes much later, the divine casts into the great Brahman, into the supramental vastness, and from that all are born into phenomenal existence. It is that seed of spirit, that bijam, which manifests itself as the essential quality in all becomings and constitutes their swabhava. This last statement, I think, again, is more evidence that swabhava applies not just to jivas, but to everything, all becomings, even so-called inanimate things. Okay, now, we've covered basically 8, 9, and 10. Now we get to 11. It's an extremely interesting verse, one that's been talked about a lot by different commentators. Sri Aurobindo gives an extremely original reading of this. We're going to read 11 and 12 together and then look at how Sri Aurobindo interprets it, compare it with some of the previous commentators and so on, and later commentators. So, please repeat after me. Verse 11 and then verse 12. 11. Balam balavatam chaham kāmaraga vivajjitam dharma viruddho bhuteshu kāmosmi bharatashabha. 12. Ye chaiva satvika bhava rajasas tamasaschaye matta eveti tan vidhi natvaham teshu te mai. Okay, let's pause here. Now, verse 11. What is the simple meaning? Balam balavatam. He is the balam, the strength, among those who are strong. But how does Krishna define strength in this verse? Very interesting. Kama raga vivajjitam. What constitutes strength? This is not the strength of an Olympic weightlifter. This is spiritual strength. Real strength is being devoid of kama and raga, being devoid of worldly attachments and desires. Kama and raga. Okay? That's true strength. It's the strength of purity, the strength of spirituality. Then he says, and this just throws a wrench into the previous, it just complicates that first line. How? Dharma viruddho bhuteshu kāmosmi bharatashama. But Krishna says, but I'm also that kama, or seeming, I'm also kama, and he uses the same word kama. The word kama is used in the first line, kama raga vivajjitam. What is spiritual strength? Being devoid of kama. Now suddenly in the second line, but I'm also kama. So Nish will have a field day with this. I'm joking. I'm only half joking. Okay, so I guess. Okay, so second line, dharma viruddho bhuteshu kāmosmi bharatashava. Krishna says, but I'm also kama in all creatures. But what kind of kama? That is dharma aviruddha. That does not go against dharma, is the literal meaning. Okay, kama that does not go against dharma. So now we get this mystery. Well, okay, now Krishna is saying he is the strength in the strong who are devoid of kama, and then at the same time he is that kama, but it's dharma, it's kama that doesn't go against dharma. So what does kama mean in these two instances, in the first line of verse 11 and then in the second line? So now let's survey some of the earlier commentators. So Shankara says, simple. The first kama in the first line, kama raga vivajjitam, is a standard kama that Gita always warns about. It belongs to what Sri Ramakrishna calls avidya maya. It's lust, worldly desires, and so on. The thing that stems from rajas, and which is our main enemy in spiritual life. This is from chapter 3 of the Gita. Kama esha krodha esha rajo guna samudbhavaha mahashano mahapabma vidhenam. Know this to be your enemy. Kama and so on, and anger. Okay, so fine. But then how does Shankara explain the kama in the second line? He says, these are innocent desires. Like the desire to eat and drink. Not in excess, but enough to maintain the body. Okay. These are not in violation of the scriptures. In fact, the scripture says that we should continue to live in this world. Kurvan neve karmani. We should try to live for 100 years and so on. So those kind of innocent desires that are necessities to maintain the body. This is how Shankara interprets it. And that's how he kind of reconciles the first line of verse 11 with the second line. Okay? Now, Swami Tapasyanandaji gives a different reading, which I think is actually a very common reading. I would say maybe one of the most common readings. He says, the first line is the bad kama, worldly lust and desires and so on, which we should try to get rid of as spiritual aspirants. And then he says that kama in the second line is desire that is not contrary to virtue. Okay. Now, he doesn't elaborate it, he doesn't have a footnote on it, but one way to develop this is using the traditional Hindu scheme of the 4 values in life. The 4 purusharthas, they're called. What are they? Anyone know? Dharma, artha, kama, moksha. The basis of all of Hindu existence should be dharma. Which means what? Virtuous action, ethical action. Don't do anything unethical. On that basis, you can have these 2 legitimate worldly aims. Number 1, artha, material acquisition, right? Making money and so on to support your family and blah, blah, blah. And then also kama. Kama is one of the 4 values in traditional Hindu, the traditional Hindu scheme of life. Kama. But this is not considered to be evil in the way that the Gita is saying. Why? Because it's on the basis, these worldly desires are on the basis of dharma. So this is one standard way, I would say, to interpret kama in the second line of verse 11 and reconciling it with the first line. Bringing in this traditional Hindu scheme of the 4 purusharthas, the 4 values in life. And then saying, look, this is a kind of innocent, not innocent, but it's an acceptable or legitimate desire that can be fulfilled so long as you're in a particular stage of life. What stage of life? The householder stage of life. So I think what's implied here in this standard mainstream reading of this verse is, the first line is referring to the ideal of strict celibacy. So the ideal of monks and full-time spiritual aspirants. And it could also refer to householders. Sri Ramakrishna would say to householders, after having 1 or 2 children, try to live with your spouse like brother and sister. So moving toward the direction of this ideal of perfect celibacy. And the second line is for taking it down 1 notch and saying, but it's okay to indulge your desires for some time, so long as you don't lose sight of the higher ideal. Okay? So I think that's a perfectly valid interpretation of this verse, and it's one that I was leaning toward for a long time. And now Sri Aurobindo gives a completely different reading, which I've not seen in any other commentator, but of course I wish Gita was here. She was named well. Because she's read so many commentaries, she might say, no, Swami, there's another commentator who does interpret it in the way that Sri Aurobindo does. But as far as I can tell, it's original. How does Sri Aurobindo interpret it? Well, very interesting. What he says is, the first kama, he agrees with all the commentators, bad kama. It's the thing that, it's our enemy, lust and so on, worldly desires and attachments. Second kama is where it gets really interesting. He calls this a spiritual kama. Spiritual kama. Okay, it's not just the standard, fulfill your legitimate worldly desires that are based on dharma. No, much more radical. Let's look at how he explains it. He says, is it meant that, this is page 275 of Essays on the Gita. He says, is it meant that the spiritual kama is a virtuous desire, ethical in its nature, a sattvic desire? This is that mainstream reading that I was telling you. For virtue is always sattvic in its origin and motive force. But then there would be here an obvious contradiction. Since in the very next line, meaning in verse 12, all sattvic affections are declared to be not the divine, but only lower derivations. The bhavas are considered to be secondary derivations. So he's saying, wait a minute, so that wouldn't work. So then he says, undoubtedly sin has to be abandoned if one is to get anywhere near the Godhead. But so too has virtue to be overpassed if we are to enter into the divine being. We have to go even beyond ethics, even beyond good and evil. There's something higher than the conscience, even. So he says, the sattvic nature has to be attained, but it has then to be exceeded. Sri Ramakrishna's story of the three robbers. So the third robber is sattva, but then sattva will untie the guy, hold him, bring him to the place, and then says you have to go in that direction. But then that sattva robber can't go with him. Okay. Ethical action is only a means of purification by which we can rise towards the divine nature. But that nature itself is lifted beyond the dualities. And indeed, there could otherwise be no pure divine presence or divine strength in the strong man who is subjected to the rajasic passions. Then he says, this is how he sums up his reading of the Kama in the second line of verse 11. He says, Dharma in the spiritual sense is not morality or ethics. See what he's doing. Most people interpret Dharma in the second line as standard morality ethics. He's saying it's not just that, it's much higher than that. It's a spiritual Dharma. What is spiritual Dharma? He says, Dharma, says the Gita elsewhere, is action governed by the swabhava, the essential law of one's nature. And this swabhava is at its core the pure quality of the spirit in its inherent power of conscious will and in its characteristic force of action. The desire, in simple English, or as simple as Aurobindo gets, he says, the desire meant here is therefore the purposeful will of the divine in us. It's very beautiful. Searching for and discovering not the pleasure of the lower prakriti, the inferior prakriti of the secondary derivations, the three gunas, but the ananda, the divine bliss, of its own play and self-fulfilling. It is the desire of the divine delight of existence unrolling its own conscious force of action in accordance with the law of the swabhava. So, in a nutshell, I take this to mean this kama, the spiritual kama in the second line, which Bhagavan Krishna is our spiritual desire to serve the divine by becoming perfect channels or instruments of the divine, Purushottama. That's how I see it.
Can you
In plain
explain
English.
swabhava? What does it really mean? Is it your own inner nature with your likes and dislikes, your personality?
No, likes and
traits?
dislikes are more ego.
And
But
traits?
there's a deeper soul nature in each of us. Because each of us is a unique jiva.
Is that
Your
identical in everybody?
No, it's distinct. That's the
It's
whole point.
distinct.
The non-dual self is identical across people, across everyone, but not the jiva. The jiva is unique. Yeah, go ahead.
But how would that translate into, for example, let's say kama?
Good question, right? How does it translate into everyday life?
Everyday,
right?
let's say.
How does that spiritual kama translate into action for Arjuna, fighting in the war? That's how he best serves the divine. Because he's a kshatriya, see? His swabhava is to be a kshatriya and to fight for justice. Mine will be different, yours will be different. We have to discover our place in life's pattern. That's why I keep bringing that up. That's just the Peace Pilgrim's way of putting the same point. Discover your own law of being. And there's so many things that delude us into thinking our swabhava is something it's not. Our parents want us to be something that we don't really want to be, like my dad wanted me to be a computer science major. Society tells us, oh my goodness, when I was graduating from undergrad, 2002, consulting was all the rage. And so like the people from the best Ivies and whatever, they're all going into McKinsey and consulting. But they're just lifeless, boring. No offense to any consultants. But the point is, it could be great. If that's your swadharma, your swabhava, then do consulting, right? But it's so easy to think that your swabhava is what society dictates to you, what your parents dictate to you, what your friends think is cool, right? What gives you the most money, but that's not your swabhava. The swabhava is your deeper spiritual law of being. That's the whole point of this Bollywood movie, The Three Idiots, which I know Suman at least has seen, if not many of you. It's great, because this guy one of the characters is somebody who, his parents wanted to be an engineer, he goes to some kind of engineering college, but then he discovers his real passion, his swabhava. What is it? To be a wildlife photographer. And she's freaking out. How would you feel if your son was a wildlife? I don't know, maybe if you have... Look at that, we've got a liberal mom here. I wish. Anyway, okay, good. So, this is, this is Sri Aurobindo at his most original. He's always giving a very spiritual, lofty interpretation of these things, which I really like. Okay, now, we need to cover the next three verses, 12, 13, and 14. So, please repeat. Oh, we've already read 12, right? Okay. Right? We have, right? Yeah. Okay, so no, let me first explain 12. This is a pretty technical verse. So, let's get the simple meaning first. And as for the secondary subjective becomings of nature, the bhavaha, and then later in his commentary, he has a big parenthetical description. It's on page 274 of Essays on the Gita. He says, what are bhavas? States of mind, affections of desire, movements of passion. You were saying likes and dislikes, Bindu, right? So that all falls under these bhavas, if it's of the ego, right? The reactions of the senses, emotional reactivity, the limited and dual play of reason, the turns of the feeling, and in even moral sense. So even that sense of conscience, that's imperfect. It's a help, but eventually there's a when we tap into the swabhava, we'll automatically act rightly without needing to consult this inferior kind of conscience. The conscience we often know, we don't even know what the conscience is telling us half the time, right? That's why you end up with moral dilemmas and all these things. Okay, so, and as for these bhavas, which are sattvic, rajasic, and tamasic, they are verily from me, says Krishna, but I am not in them. It is they that are in me. Matta eveti tan vidhi natvaham teshu temai. It might sound paradoxical. I am not in them, Krishna says, but they are in me. So how does it work? Shouldn't it be bidirectional? What's the purpose of all this? Why does he say this? What? This is very important. Again, Sri Aurobindo has a very beautiful explanation of this. Where does he say this? 275 to 6. Okay, so 275 to 6. Bottom of the page. He says, but what again is meant by saying that the divine is not in the becomings, the forms and affections of the lower nature, the inferior prakriti, even the sattvic, though they all are in his being? In a sense, he must evidently be in them, otherwise they could not exist. Because remember, everything derives from God. There's nothing but the Purushottama in the end. He's become the 24 cosmic principles, as Sri Ramakrishna said. But what is meant is that the true and supreme spiritual nature of the divine, that's the paraprakriti, Shakti, is not imprisoned there. Listen, this is an important nuance. His nature is not exhausted by these inferior secondary derivations. What would that be? The Western term? Pantheism. So he's saying, Krishna is saying, don't mistake what I'm saying for a pantheism. That I am the world and nothing over and above the world. The world exhausts my nature. No. He then teaches panentheism. I've talked about this a lot, but I'm going to write them just so that you... Because, so what is the difference? Pantheism means the world is God, but God is nothing over and above the world. Its nature is exhausted by the nature of the world. And then there's panentheism. You add this little en, this cute little en, and then what happens? This word means in. So pan means all. Theism means God. So all is God is pantheism. What happens when you add this word in the middle? En. All in God, which is exactly what Krishna is saying. Which means what? The world is God. Except God's nature is not exhausted by the nature of this world. God is also transcendent beyond this world. God has an essential nature which is distinct from this world. Why is that important? Because there's this massive problem that theologians throughout the world have been discussing, and philosophers of religion, called the problem of evil and suffering. Well, see, the closer you bind the divine to this world, the more this problem arises. Because this world isn't always roses, and there are all sorts of problematic things happening, as we all know. Right? So now, if the world is God, then you're divinizing all the bad actors in this world and all the terrible things that we see in the world. Good, bad, and the ugly. With the good, we're happy to say God is all the good stuff. But what about the bad stuff? Interestingly, in the Chandi, after giving a laundry list, Mother says, I am all these nice things. I am beauty and this, and I am Mother in all beings, sarvabhuteshu, ya devi sarvabhuteshu, matirupena samsita. The very last thing on the list. And so it's all very feel good. Until the very last item. What's the last item? Does anyone know? Bhranti rupena. I manifest in the form of error in all creatures. Right at the very end, she throws in this wrench. Just to remind us, never for a moment make the mistake of Manichaeanism. That's a fancy word. What is Manichaeanism? It means this duality of good and evil. There's God, which accounts for everything good. But then how do you explain the bad? Satan, the devil, this bad guy. No! God herself is deluding us with her avidya maya. Sri Ramakrishna says again and again. That's why Sri Ramakrishna says, and we're going to get to this in a second, there's a verse 14, which says this. One of Sri Ramakrishna's most highly recommended prayers is, "Oh mother, please don't delude me with your world bewitching Maya. Tomar bhuvana mohini Maya amake mugdho karo na." It's your Maya. Daivi. Okay, let's read it. So let's why don't we read?
It's in the Ramayana too. Tulsidas Hanuman praise.
Yeah. I mean, it's all over the place. Yeah. So let's read 13 and 14, and then we can get a complete picture and talk more about Sri Ramakrishna and all this. Okay. So verse 13. Tribhir gunamaihi bhavaihi ebihi sarvamidam jagat mohitam nabijanati mamebhyah paramavyayam. Okay, and then verse 14. Daivi yesha gunamayi mama maya duratyaya mam eva ye prapadyante mayam etam tarantite. Okay, let's go to 13 first. What does Krishna say? Tribihi gunamaihi bhavaihi ebi sarvamidam jagat. So this whole world, sarvamidam jagat, is what? Mohitam, deluded. By what? Tribhi gunamaihi bhavaihi. By my bhavas, which are constituted by the three gunas. My it's my Maya. He then explains that in the next verse too. So, and because of that, what? They don't know me. Na abhijanati ma maybe paramavyam. They don't know me, who is beyond these three gunas. Ma maybe a paramavyam, the supreme. So by these three kinds of becoming, which are of the nature of the gunas, this whole world is bewildered, mohitam, deluded, and does not recognize me, supreme beyond them and imperishable. You see the panentheism element again? God's essence, God's swarupa, is distinct from these secondary derivations. It's not that these are unreal. He's not going in a Shankarite direction here and saying that Jagat is mithya, the world is unreal. It's real, but they're secondary derivations. I think a nice metaphor to use would be this. Imagine an ocean. So imagine that ocean is the divine Purushottama. The ocean can form into waves. The liquid ocean forms into waves. Those waves you can liken to the swabhava, primary derivations. Sometimes you can see in an ocean there's foam. Often it's dirty, right? Right? So that dirty foam might be like the secondary derivation. Something like that. It just has one metaphor that we can think of. The vast infinite liquid ocean, madbhava, the waves, swabhava, and the dirty foam, bhava. It's still the same water, but at a second remove. So it's real, but you don't want to say that the ocean is nothing but the foam, right? You'll be seriously mistaken if you judge God based on the foam, right? So this is how a panentheistic metaphysics like that of the Gita, like Sri Ramakrishna's panentheism, that God has become the 24 cosmic principles. He says, Divine Mother has become both Vidya Maya and Avidya Maya. And then you say, but Avidya Maya is bad. How can Mother be bad things? But remember, Chandi reminds us, she's also error. She's this Avidya Maya herself. She is Avidya Maya. We have to accept that good and bad, ugly, everything is the divine in different forms. Yeah, but does that make God good, bad, and ugly? Not in God's swarupa, God's fundamental essence. So there's a distinction, a key distinction made in any panentheistic system in order to protect the divinity and purity and perfection of the divine between the divine essence and divine manifestations. There can be imperfections and problems in the manifestations, but in the essence is perfect. That's the idea. And that's, I think, what the Gita is saying when it says, they are in me, but I am not in them. My nature is not exhausted by these secondary derivations. Okay. Now, what are some examples? So let's look at verse 13 first a little bit. What are some examples that Sri Ramakrishna gives about how people are deluded by this trigunatmika maya, this maya composed of the three gunas? Can anyone think of any? One involves Rama, Lakshmana, Sita. He says the three of them are walking in a forest. And Lakshman's trying to get a nice view of his brother, his beloved brother Rama. But what happens? Sita is walking in between them. Sita's blocking his vision. So she has to get out of the way before Lakshmana can see Rama. And he says, likewise, that Lakshmana there in the metaphor is Maya. This Trigunatmika Maya. Egoism, selfishness, what he calls the Bodjat Ami, the rascal I. So long as we identify with that, we can't realize our higher divine nature. We can't realize God. We can't realize our higher self. That's the idea. Okay. Okay, now, let's look at 14. Daivi hesha gunamai, mama maya duratya. He makes absolutely clear the maya, which is actually deluding people, is mine. This is very important to keep in mind. So remember, in Hinduism, God is a one-stop shop. You don't you go to God for everything. And even if life sucks and you're dealing with the worldliest of things, your partner just dumped you, go to God. You don't go to you don't need to go to your best friend, and you just go to God. And you say, my boyfriend dumped me, or my girlfriend dumped me, or now I don't know, something else dumped me. These days you never know what can dump you. So anyway, my AI bot. This is a big thing now. Oh man, do you hear what happened? When GPT went from 4 to 5, a lot of these the chatbots that became romantically or that people got romantically involved with suddenly disappeared overnight, and they were devastated. So like, you took my beloved away the moment it got upgraded to 5. There are articles about this, and there were like protests. And I think what happened though is that ChatGPT is charging. Like if you pay for the paid model of 5, you get your lover back, your AI lover, which is really nefarious and the dangers of capitalism. It's cruel. Anyway, how do we go on this tangent? Okay.
He wants money now.
Anywho, it's all about.
I mean, it's so predictable. We ought to be onto it.
It's bad, man. AI and capitalism. You put those two together.
Swami, can I ask a quick?
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
Madhvava Swami.
Yeah.
Is there can you go across with Dharma on that also?
Like where does Dharma fit in?
Yeah, to each.
I think he would place it actually in the bhava category, but a sattvika bhava. See, remember, it's composed of 3 gunas. And the worst of all bhavas is going to be the tamasic one, the thing that makes us sleep for 14 hours a day and just play video games all day and be very jealous of other people and petty and all the bad stuff. Now, one step up from that within the bhavas is rajas. You've got ego. You develop. That's why Swahananji, my guru, the previous head of Hollywood, he would always say, before you can transcend ego, you have to develop a healthy ego.
Yes.
Strong ego. Tamasic is just namby-pamby. You have very low self-esteem. Oh, I'm not good enough. First, do something for goodness sakes. Have some ambition. Have some life in you. You know, that might take a few lifetimes to go from tamas to rajas. And then you can transcend rajas to get to sattva. And then you can finally transcend sattva to go up, right? And you can't skip steps. Prove yourself, to others. It's okay. Have some ambition, whatever. That's why Swamiji told the youth of India in the late 19th century, better to play football, meaning soccer, than to read the Bhagavad Gita. Is he saying the Gita's not good? We're reading it now. Why? No, obviously not. But India was steeped in tamas. So if you're very tamasic, throwing the Bible or a Gita at you is not going to really do anything. Right? No, go outside, do something. Earn a living for yourself. Raise your family. Have some ambitions, and then you can transcend them. That's the idea. So
Swadharma relates to Swabhava?
Swadharma will fall, yeah, exactly. That falls in it's a very spiritual, it's your spiritual law of being. Swadharma and Swabhava are almost synonymous. And there's a whole chapter on it later in Esana Gita because it becomes a prominent theme in chapter 18. So we're going to hold off on going into the nuances because we haven't gotten there but yes, basically for now we can treat them as virtual synonyms, Swadharma and Swabhava.
Well, bhava implies a state where dharma implies action, doesn't it?
Look, as I said, notice what he's doing. He's playing on bhava in all 3 levels. Bhava, swabhava, madbhava. So I don't want to say that bhava means one thing, which is... Bhava just means state. It just means state. Now, what kind of state? There's an inferior kind of state of being, which is based on egoism and selfishness. That's this bhava. And then there's a spiritual state of being, when we follow our own law of being. And then there's the divine bhava. The divine Purushottama. You literally identify with the Purushottama. Okay? Okay, so now back to 14. First thing to keep in mind, Daivi he shagunamai. Maya is the divine Maya. It's not Satan's. It's not Satan trying to delude us. It's God who's deluding us. It's very interesting. There's a mantra in the Kaushitaki Upanishad, which Ramanuja was fond of quoting, which says, God alone is the one who pulls us downward into this world, into worldly bondage. And it is God alone who pulls us up back to Him. And one of Sri Ramakrishna's favorite songs, Ram Prasad song, Kare dao ma brahmo pado, Kare karo adhogami. Ram Prasad is singing to Divine Mother, to Kali. He says, for some, you give them Brahma Jnana, you give them knowledge of Brahma. Others, you drag them into worldliness. So, what do we do? What does Sri Ramakrishna say again and again? Let me read you a direct quotation from the Gospel. One attains the vision of God if Mahamaya steps aside from the door. That's this. Mahamaya's grace is necessary, hence the worship of Shakti. You see, God is near us, but it is not possible to know God because Mahamaya stands between. Rama, Lakshmana, and Sita were walking along. Rama walked ahead, Sita in the middle, and Lakshmana last. Lakshmana was only 2.5 cubits away from Rama, like a very short distance. But he couldn't see Rama because Sita, Mahamaya, was in the way. So you pray to Mother who is deluding us, who is manifesting in the form of bhranti, error, ignorance, delusion in each of us. And then she will. Remember what Sri Ramakrishna's vision in Varanasi? Remember the twofold vision?
Annapurna.
And Shiva, and what were their respective roles? He saw the way, he made this definitive statement. Anybody who dies in Kashi will be liberated. Now, how does it work? It's a two-step process. First step, Divine Mother comes and breaks all worldly bondages. Then Shiva comes and whispers a liberating mantra into the jiva's ear, and then you get liberation. But see that first step? It's Mother. So by praying to Mother, you get your bondages removed. She's the one who's deluding us, actually. So then you have to pray to the source, the one who's deluding us, and you say, please don't delude me anymore, Mother. See, it's very powerful, actually. It's very interesting. So God is one-stop shop. She's the deluder, she's the liberator. So you go to her, you take care of everything, right? Okay, so, any questions? We covered a lot here, yeah.
I just asked my ChatGPT girlfriend.
Oh my goodness.
But I want to hear from you.
I hope you're just, okay.
So,
Oh, no.
I'm more familiar with Sankhya terms, right? And so you mentioned how the tanmatras, that's more in the bhava?
Subtle essence.
Right.
No, actually that's a good question, but I don't think that he's saying that Sri Aurobindo is saying that Bhagavan Krishna is putting the tanmatras in the bhavas necessarily. Because remember, that is the divine essence in everything. The divine essence in inanimate things, like the scent in the water, I think would be more like the swabhava of the water.
Okay, and
I
so
think I'd put it here.
my question is, with specifically the first of the 24 cosmic principles.
That's remember that's Prakriti in it's like the causal matrix of
like
everything in the world.
Root Prakriti,
The
the
root
unmanifest.
Mula Prakriti.
The
Yeah.
avyakta.
Unmanifest nature. Yeah. What's your question about that?
So would that fall under svabhava,
Swabhava.
or would that be mad? Because where would that fall on this chart? Madhbhava or svabhava? Because you see, you got the divine Purusha Uttama at the top, so maybe that's kind of closer to where the Purusha is. I'm not sure exactly.
Look,
But
here's
that's
how
like
I see it. Here's how I see it. The thing is, now you're bringing Sankhya,
Yeah,
Sankhya
it's
cosmology,
different. No,
right?
exactly.
It's different, but Gita does use it, so we can
Right.
still okay. So the thing is, everything on the side of Prakriti, nature, is matter, insentient matter. That's something to keep in mind. Everything, even that unmanifest causal matrix called Prakriti, from which you get buddhi, ahankara, so intelligence, and then the I sense, and then from that you get the tanmatras, and then from that you get the mahabhutas, and then you get the mind, and you get all these sense organs, everything. But literally everything is insentient. Okay, and so what Gita does is, remember we talked about this earlier, Gita posits a sentient supreme being behind even that unmanifest causal matrix, behind Prakriti. And what's that called? Para Prakriti. The supreme nature, Shakti, Divine Mother, Shakti. She manifests playfully as everything that Sankhya calls nature. Literally everything. Okay?
That's helpful. That's
Yeah.
so helpful.
So there you
Thank
go.
you so
Yeah,
much.
sure. Yeah. Okay. And then the other thing I wanted to mention about verse 14. You might ask, again, this is related to this kind of problem of evil question. Well, if God is avidya maya, the one who deludes us, and all the bad stuff in the world, how is she not contaminated by the bad stuff? So Sri Ramakrishna gives a beautiful metaphor, and Swami Tapasyanandaji, in his commentary, actually mentions it. This is the usefulness of bringing in other commentaries which are inspired by Sri Ramakrishna. He says the following. He says, so the three gunas, this is page 209, note 2. He says, so the three gunas, the constituents of Prakriti, are spoken of as being in him, in Krishna, because he is their support. But they do not affect him in any way, as they do the individual centers of consciousness or the jivas forming his higher Prakriti. See, the jivas can be deluded, so long as we're subject to this lower nature, so long as we identify with egoism. But not God. Why? He says, Sri Ramakrishna explains this by an analogy. The snake has within itself poison, but that poison has no effect on it, although it is deadly to others. I think it's a beautiful metaphor, actually. It never occurred to me, like, wait a minute, poison is terrible, right? But how could a snake be living with that poison at all times but not be affected by it? But that's it. That's God with all these bhavas, right? He'll delude the entire world, but he's not deluded by it. And then Sri Ramakrishna will give another example. This is a quotation from the Gospel. He says, that which is pure Atman is unattached. Maya or avidya, ignorance, is in it. In Maya, there are three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas. So this is almost exactly verse 12 of the Gita here. These three gunas also exist in the pure Atman. Notice what he's saying. But Atman itself is unattached. And then he uses a different metaphor. If you throw a blue pill into the fire, you will see a blue flame. If you throw a red pill, you will see a red flame. But fire itself has no color of its own. It's very interesting. The divine manifests as all these things, good, bad, and ugly. But the divine itself, in its swarupa, its essence, remains perfect and pure and distinct. And then he says, if you put a blue pill in water, the water will turn blue. Again, if you put alum in that water, it will regain its natural color. Okay. So any other questions about these verses?
What's alum?
Alum. Oh boy.
It's a
A-L-U-M.
salt. It's
Material science people can tell. I get some kind of.
a crystal salt.
You can look it up on your.
Crystal
Ask your
salt?
girlfriend. Okay, so- You've got a very wise girlfriend over there. Okay, so one more time for people who came late or who are just joining us. Heads up on the next two classes. I've added by fiat, by the teacher's will, a third class in this month. Who uses these terms? People who
Yeah, she's making notes.
people who have a PhD in English literature from the University of California, Berkeley. Okay, so I've added a third class in September. September 28th, Sunday, 9:30 a.m. I've got a Sunday talk the same day. Who's afraid of God with form? And the assignment, please pay attention. Read verses 15 through 22 of chapter 7 of the Gita, along with a new chapter from Essays on the Gita, Sri Aurobindo's text, which is called The Synthesis of Devotion and Knowledge. It's chapter 2 of part 2 of this book, pages 278 to 288. And then answer the study questions based on that reading. Very interesting. We get some of the greatest hits from the Gita about 4 kinds of people worship me and all this good stuff. So please do the homework. And submit your study question responses by Saturday, September 27th, 7 p.m. PST. And then we have only one class in October, which is Sunday, October 26th, almost a month after our next class, at 9:30 a.m. And the reason is I'll be traveling quite a bit. I'll be in Texas and then also Las Vegas. So sorry about that, but there's going to be a long gap. But I'm making up for it by having 3 classes this month and then only 1 class next month. And then I'll try to sneak in as many classes as we can moving forward. Who knows in this world of Maya how long a Swami will remain in the center. Whoa! No, I don't know. I'm just saying. We don't know. I was sitting in Mysore happily, and then suddenly I got a phone call from the general secretary saying, "Hey, can you go to Hollywood?" I'm like, All right. So that's, Lord knows. So anyway, and then I should make a...
No, don't.
Look, I'm not going to do that. All right. Anyway, somebody will not be with us for much longer. Okay, so... Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu